to mention it. In trying to think about the evolution of human consciousness, how did it come to be? Most of you are probably familiar with my theory of psilocybin influence, and I don't want to recapitulate that here. But here are some less often said things about it. It's clear, I think, if you look at the natural world with an unbiased eye, that the highest intelligence, and I don't want to have a knockdown, drag-out debate about this, but the highest intelligence, to my mind, without a lot of arm-waving, is the behavior exhibited by large hunting cats, predators, animals which live on plants, like cattle, for example, have no interest in observing the behavior of other animals. They are very preoccupied with just churning through herbaceous foliage. Predators, large carnivores, on the other hand, to be a successful hunter, any hunter will tell you, you must understand, note this word, the thing you hunt. So in a sense, what these large cats are able to do is they're able to think like foxes, think like rabbits, think like antelope. And this allows them to successfully predate upon these animals. Well then, it's very interesting that in shamanism worldwide, at its most primitive level, and often in the presence of hallucinogenic plants, you find this emphasis on large predatory cats and jaguar consciousness and shape-shifting. And essentially, it's almost as though the earliest form of human consciousness was not human consciousness at all. We saw the predatory success of these large cats, we admired it, we imitated it, and people who could become cats are what would be a kind of a shaman, a jaguar shaman. Very interesting. Well, but then the difference between a hunting cat, I believe, and a human being is that the intelligence of the hunting cat is environmentally cued by circumstance. An antelope runs by, it pursues and kills it in a certain way which has worked before. Human beings, away from the hunt, intoxicated by just large amounts of fresh meat, which if you're, marginally nutritionally based and there's a big kill and the whole village eats, then usually everybody has sex together, and then there's probably drug taking and religious thanksgiving and so forth. So everybody's feeling pretty good. And what emerges there is fantasy. This is what we do. We can command images in the absence of their physical stimulus. So, and being highly eroticized animals, sexual fantasy is a major preoccupation of primates, apparently, as you've observed. If you've ever taken children to the monkey house at the zoo, then you have to explain all this wild masturbation that's going on. It leads to fascinating discussions of animal and human behavior. So highly sexed human beings eating well after imitating cats, after having sex, after taking drugs, are certain then to contemplate the great what-ifs of life. What if we had gone earlier to the water hole? Perhaps we would have found more game than we did. And then in the erotic domain, erotic fantasy is entirely a series of what-ifs. What if I had been accepted in my approach to so-and-so, and then what if they had taken me into the bushes, and then what if, and what if. And as the hormones start flowing, the what-ifs start coming with greater clarity. Well, this eroticization and this phenomenon of hunting all tumbled together, I think, probably was the basis for the emergence of early human consciousness. And of course, it circles around the issue of free will. Implicit in the what if is the path not taken. And by endlessly contemplating these bifurcating paths of what ifs, slowly an early human being or a proto-hominid would come to have the sense that, behind all of this, looking at all of this, is something called choice maker. And then self-identification. I am choice maker. I choose. And out of the images in my mind, certain ones, to use a Whiteheadian phrase, undergo the formality of actually occurring. And I think, that and the psychedelic stimulation to the imagination and the early human environment of nutritional pressure, strange foods, alkaloid-heavy foods, impinging on the genome, so forth and so on, really was what took us over the threshold. It was the combination of these hunting fantasies with erotic fantasy driven by drugs and nutrition. Just a new piece of data which is grist for this mill. Some of you have heard me talk about Roland Fisher's experiments where he showed graduate students parallel bars and then gave them small amounts of psilocybin and showed that edge detection was increased in the presence of psilocybin. Visual acuity. Well, I gave a talk like this in Mexico, and Sasha Shulgin was in the audience, and he said there's an even better set of Fisher experiments which make your point even more strongly. He did another set of experiments in which he built an apparatus where you could raise a white bar over words projected on a screen so that only the first, say the words were 3 inches tall, only the first quarter inch could be shown. We'd say, people, can you read this sentence? With only 10% of the letter shapes visible. On psilocybin, people were far better at this task than on the Natch. And if you analyze what is this task, it's a very complex coordination of detail. Very complex. It's the ability to extract information from a situation and reach the correct conclusion. So, I think we're on very firm ground here in suggesting that drugs do not impede one's access to the nature of reality. They often demonstrably and in very statistically controlled situations can be shown to enhance one's ability to coordinate and understand reality. Yeah. You mean after the drug wore off, could they do this? I doubt that the experiment was done. It would be interesting. Of course, the assumption would be no, but the experiment would certainly be worth doing. Can one learn on psilocybin to then do something which persists after the drug is gone? It's an interesting question. Yes, I noticed when I was taking Prozac that what it does is it sets you slightly forward in social space, and that once you have sufficiently analyzed what it does, you don't have to take Prozac. You can fake it. It's an attitude. It's basically a slight attitudinal adjustment toward social space. I describe it as leaning slightly into it. And once you become familiar with the feeling, you can just do it. So the drug becomes irrelevant. It has taught you a behavior, the positive feedback from which is so positive that in the absence of the drug, you continue to behave this way.
So is that when you just do
I'm sure that hasn't been studied. But, I think serotonin release is related to social space. And, each of us, we feel a certain level of attraction and distance to each other. And we absolutely accept this. We don't understand that other people are different. Occasionally it will be in your face when somebody will stand in your social space. And then you realize, oh, this person is insensitive. They stand too close. But except in these kind of extreme cases, and sometimes indicating a pathology, we manage to adjust these social distances. But it's a kind of index of alienation. How interested are you in what other people have to say?
Because it's not something that's cultural, because it's a new thing.
Yeah, well, I think in cities, though, people sense invisible rules of social distancing, not only social distancing, but how eye contact is to be handled when, a bunch of guys are loitering, flipping knives. You don't cross to the other side of the street because then they know you're, and you don't make eye contact because that's confrontive, and you just have to tune your aura this certain way. We primates are very, very subtly adept at this, but it doesn't register in language much. No, this is something I talk about when I talk about human evolution. See, most animals specialize their foods very rigidly. This is almost genetically programmed. It's very rare to find an omnivorous animal. Almost primates are the only ones, and not all primates. And the thinking is that this is a very conservative food acquisition strategy is necessary because it holds down natural rates of mutation. If you just started eating plants, you would contact all kinds of weird things because plants produce weird tertiary and secondary compounds that are designed to attract insects or repel insects, or and you would get all screwed up. One argument for what happened to us is that we had a very primate-like diet of insects and fruits and canopy available foods, and when the canopy got under nutritional pressure, we had two choices: either go extinct or begin to experiment with food. And somehow the thing that has always saved us is our flexibility. Somehow in that situation we didn't go extinct. And I've just recently seen new papers about, in several parts of the world, they've discovered species of monkeys that only leave the canopy to acquire fungus, the jungle treetops. But they will come down to eat certain fungi. And even in the northwest coast forests of Oregon, there are these flying squirrels which never come to the ground except they have some amazing ability to locate truffles. And somebody described these things to me. They come sailing down and they hit the ground at, it looks like about 20 miles an hour, dig furiously right where they hit, grab the truffles, and they're out of there. I think psilocybin in the early human diet was something that we encountered as we moved into the grasslands, and that was a very tryptamine-rich environment. Not only mushrooms, but gramine in grasses and cereals. Baboons and other grassland primates eat a lot of corms, the roots of grasses, and that stuff has a lot of toxic stuff in it. The thing about our flexibility, we've talked in these workshops about the bonobo versus the chimpanzee in terms of sexual styles. We differ by chimpanzees by 3% in the genome, There's another kind of chimpanzee called pygmy chimpanzees or bonobos that are not really physically smaller than regular chimpanzees. Their genome differs only by 2%, but the sexual styles of these two animals are so different that it's astonishing that two animals so similar in genome could have such completely diametrically sexual styles. The chimpanzees are monogamous, they have pair bonding, they have sharply enforced and maintained male dominance hierarchies, so forth and so on. The bonobos are polymorphically sexual, orgiastic, tolerate homosexuality, tolerate incest, tremendous, all conflict is mediated through release of sexual energy. Well, then you have human beings. And we are apparently right on the cusp because we have, rigidly defined monogamous societies where any breach of these monogamous rules brings death and disgrace. And we have polygamous societies, and we have societies where wives are shared with brothers as a matter of course. Very interesting that our sexual style is not under genetic control. And I maintain that part of our strange position in reality has to do with the fact that we in the past, in the distant hominid past, had a male dominance hierarchy as sharply defined probably as the chimpanzees. Anxiety about female sexual activity, anxiety about lines of male paternity, rigid enforcement of all this, so forth and so on. At some time in our evolutionary past, when psilocybin became a major component of our diet, it acted as a catalytic enzyme on the psychoerotic complex and dissolved this tendency toward male dominance and replaced it with a more highly sexually expressive, polygamous, orgiastic style of tribalism, which persisted for a long time, maybe 50,000 years, as long as there was sufficient psilocybin in the diet that increased sexual activity and dissolution of ego and so forth was maintained. But the genetic programming was never stripped out. Well, so then after 50,000 years of orgiastic polygamy and that kind of social glue, and notice the interesting thing about an orgiastic society is no concept of male paternity. Men do not know who their children are. Consequently, there is no sense of my children. There is an enormous loyalty to the children of the group. Children collectively then are seen as a very precious and conservable resource. Well, eventually this happy story came to an end, and the mushrooms dried up, became seasonal, the grassland turned to desert, and with a big thump, everybody got kicked out of Eden, and with the withdrawal of the psilocybin into shamanism, into seasonal festivals, and eventually its complete suppression and disappearance by anxious male dominators, the old hominid style of egocentrism and dominance hierarchy reestablished itself right at the time when agriculture was invented. And so suddenly then what you get are kingship, standing armies, role specialization, marginalization of females, a whole bunch of negative, in my humble opinion, social styles and behaviors. We then are the unhappy inheritors of this. For 10,000 years, roughly, we've been away from the sacramental dissolving of male ego and sexual dominance hierarchies. And so there's a huge amount of sexual contradiction and unhappiness, and this doesn't work, and that doesn't work, and nothing seems to work, and this seems to be our cross to bear. Well, it's because we are neither bonobos nor chimpanzees. We are somewhere in between, and it's almost a matter of which side of the bed you get up on, or what you ate that day, or what your drug habits are, what kind of a sexual creature you are, and what kind of styles of sexual behavior you're comfortable with or uncomfortable with. It's a very curious thing, and it's related to our high intelligence. Somehow, I don't exactly understand this, except maybe the connecting key is erotic fantasy. That erotic fantasy as an exercise eventually turns into fantasy, period, and then that eventually turns into government, poetry, religion, drama, humor, mathematics, music, so forth and so on. Anybody want a short comment?
In the right way.
Yeah, basically what we want to do... We want to become as biological as possible. And then some of these issues about the internet will disappear. I mean, somebody recently, here's an interesting statistic. Somebody told me recently that in an average square inch of soil, there's 500 miles of mycelial fiber. 500 miles of mycelial fiber in every cubic inch of topsoil on this planet. Well, imagine if you could plug into that net. We don't have to lay copper or fiber optics. If you're subtle enough, the wires are already there. Yeah, what would... Well, when you take psilocybin, it's interesting that many people report the onset of hallucination is always the onset of you see a white network against darkness. You actually see the mycelium, and then shortly thereafter the visions. And, what would we think of the internet if we didn't have to lay any wire or transmit anything through the air, but we could just plug in to the wiring already in the ground? That may sound like pie in the sky, but it's not that.
Tesla proposed that same theorem back in the...
Well, he wanted to transmit electricity through the ground. I don't think he realized that there were biological wires to do it because of the fineness of these things. But I think, commandeering, co-opting, modeling, and copying nature is what it's all about. This is what alchemy understood. Nature is the great teacher. Nature has had, 5 billion years to go down the worthless pathways and the toxic pathways, and has always returned to a certain Tao of an economy of construction and architecture and energy that is more elegant than anything we can possibly imagine. So, a truly human future lies in integrating, studying, imitating, and becoming part of the natural world without leaving any of our so-called technology or database behind. Well, that's it for this evening, I think. Is there anything hanging from this afternoon? Yeah.
We wanted that. Yeah, that was a grouping.
Oh, yeah? What about that?
Well, can you explain that theory about how we don't have 75% females
men.
No,
What was,
female.
what was the
Yeah, we
statistic
didn't know
first
what
off?
Well, it was in the context of supposing that you were going to reduce population by appealing to high-tech, industrial, educated women to have one child only. Well, then you could leave it there, and you would get this demographic collapse. But if you also, you'd have a 50% reduction of population in 30 years, and every successive 30 years.
Still be 50-50.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So then the other possibility is, if you want to address the perceived overexpression of masculinity in society, I'm saying rather than try and change men, change the ratio of men to women. Obviously, if you do this, and there are more women than men, women will occupy more managerial positions. There will be a compensatory feminizing of society, which seems to me less distorting and less a form of social engineering than trying to use the mass media to guilt trip men into suppressing testosterone levels. In other words, so just, and yeah, I feel that's going on. That men, and there are a number of things associated with that men are undervalued for the simple reason that there are too damn many of them. It's a drag on the market.
You're liking this concept.
30-70 would be probably is the natural ratio. It's well known. Well, it's 70% women, 30% men. Yeah.
Why would that be natural?
Well, it's well known that maternal resources in almost all societies are disproportionately directed toward male babies. And even at that, the best you can achieve is 50-50. So, that, if everything were to relax, probably male births would decline in the direction that I'm indicating. It's just, I have not heard anybody else advocate this. No radical lesbian collective. Nobody has seemed to notice that you could, what is it, sacrosanct? You can't suggest that these population ratios could be shifted. Why not? It makes perfect sense.
No, it doesn't make sense.
Why?
I totally don't understand what you're saying. I don't
Well, you understand the demographic collapse occasioned by one woman, one child, right?
I can understand.
Well, if you have fewer men, you have more women advancing at a faster rate. You have more managerial positions open to women. Well, unless the men grow proportionately more competitive as their numbers decrease. I mean, you can play all kinds of games with curves here. But it's not written adamantine. It's just something to get you thinking about the fact that we're not trapped in any sense of the word. The fact that just with a one-woman, one-child policy, do that for 120 years, and a major item on the political agenda will be the question, are there enough human beings in the world? You'd be down under 500 million people in 120 years without pogroms, epidemics, extermination campaigns, genocide. No, just simply one woman, one child. So the idea that there's some huge Malthusian momentum that can't be overcome, the momentum is not Malthusian, it's cultural and ideological. And why is that a good idea?
How does it work? Aborting male children or something?
Well, I'm saying equal distribution of maternal resources would probably cause it to happen naturally. That in the present situation, male babies receive more extensive attention, nutrition, blah, blah. So just,
In this country?
yeah.
Bringing up some emotion. So
Well, any solution is unworkable in the real world without bringing up some emotion. It's the principle of you don't make omelets without breaking eggs. The only course which seems to raise no emotion, and that also raises emotion, is business as usual. We're teetering on the brink of several forms of apocalypse at once. The idea that you're going to waltz out of here without maybe raising the hair on the back of your neck is probably fairly naive. But this just shows, the situation is open and flexible. I'm not even interested in defending this to the death. I just think it's interesting that nobody else has ever suggested.
I think there's good reason why.
Well, even the one woman, one child thing.
I think I'm on your side with that one.
So we've come halfway. That's progress. Well, I just think that there's an excessive strain on all resources. It could be cured in many ways. It could be cured by limiting population. It could be limited by limiting consumerism, by limiting availability of consumer goods, by what Hazel Henderson calls real cost pricing. Which causes a can of beer to go to $30, this kind of thing. There are many approaches. The point is not any given solution or ideological axe to grind, but that the situation is multivariable and highly flexible and not determined. That's the basic message. Well, yeah, that's what I said, all these other ways. That was what the list was about, other ways to do it. And, then there's also the horror trips, like Ebola and all that, which is lurking out there. If we don't come up with a solution, there are natural processes which eventually, at some point, will begin to cut in. Ebola is a typical example. Well, maybe that's enough about all of that. Okay. Moving on. Tonight we'll look at this mathematical model of the time wave and talk about it, and maybe in a slightly different form than we have in the past. I can do this as a set piece thing, which is a voyage through time where you start with billions of years on the screen and then hundreds of millions and then decades, asking you to compare your knowledge of history, specious though it may be, to the unfolding wave, and ask yourself if there is some kind of resonance for you, some kind of congruence that you're looking at. First of all, that there is such a thing as novelty, that we can hypothetically quantify and chart like a stock price or the rise and fall of temperature. In other words, a measurable quality in the universe called novelty, opposed by another measurable and contra-intuitive concept, habit. And I mentioned this, I think, today or last night, the universe as a struggle between these two fundamental forces, habit and novelty. Habit building up, conserving, perpetuating, acting as the medium of causal efficiency through time, and novelty, perturbation of habit, the unexpected symmetry breaks, the unexpected turning, the statistically improbable input into the system. And then once you have these two ideas in place, for me it seems very obvious then, based on the straightforward story that the combined natural sciences lay out for us, that the story of the universe is the story then of what I call the conservation or the accumulation of habit. Habit is what the universe, of novelty. Novelty is what the universe is producing out of disorganization, out of the incredibly habitual laws of raw physics. The universe is slowly perturbing itself to more novel and higher states of complexity and order. And it does this by a series of different tricks, and we talked about dissipative structures and autopoiesis and autocatalytic hypercycles and all this jargon that basically means perturbation through fluctuation to higher states of order. And so by this version of reality, nature is a continuous gradient from the laws which rule the motion of atoms and galaxies, basically Newton's laws, a continuous gradient through biology, into psychology, into game and information theory and that sort of thing. In other words, the divisions of the natural and social sciences are purely artificial. And over all of this phenomena arches this law of the conservation of novelty. But it isn't a smooth curve. It isn't an uninterrupted descent into novelty. It's a tendency toward novelty which can be perturbed and interrupted on any scale, so that it may be perturbed and interrupted for milliseconds, or it may be perturbed and interrupted for 100 million years. But in any case, given a sufficient amount of time, this tendency toward the conservation and production of novelty will reassert itself. Well, several interesting consequences follow from a model like this. One is human beings become much more interesting players in the game. Human beings emerge not then as chance agglomerations of advanced biology, statistically improbable, but nevertheless somehow present without definable purpose or raison d'etre. Changes from that into the inevitable consequences of the conservation of novelty. So humanity goes from being the meaningless and the unexpected to the inevitable. And it means then that the enterprise of human civilization becomes not this existential imputing of values out of essence onto reality, but instead it becomes an acting out of a portion of the natural universe. In other words, it upsets the existential apple cart. It makes people matter. It not only makes people matter, it makes history matter. It not only makes history matter, it gives it an arrow toward an understandable goal. Something that we would call complexity or concrescence or holographic self-realization, something that we can now, from our present position in technology and so forth, actually see ahead of us how this might work, how there might potentially be a world of distributed human consciousness in biological bodies with some kind of very painless interface into a godlike sense of omniscience, which was the electrically stabilized and maintained data field of the species. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about here. We can see how we could get there from here with nothing more than refinements of our technology and our engineering goals. So that thing, the eschaton, becomes then a kind of inevitable attractor. This process is not entirely causal in the sense that it does not entirely proceed simply from the past into the future. The notion being put forward here is that time is not a perfectly smooth, perfectly level, perfectly frictionless surface on which you are free to skate in any dimension with equal energy. No, time is, like everything else in the universe, time has a fine structure. It has a textural quality to itself. It has, in fact, a kind of landscape. And events, systems of cause and effect, flow over this landscape, seeking something that we can visualize as low energy states or states of high novelty, which are defined as the bottoms of these creodes, these epigenetic valleys through which processes are flowing. Well, this is a very different picture of time than the Newtonian picture. The Newtonian picture is a conservative picture, but inadequate to experience. It holds on to the Greek philosophical conception that the universe should be describable using perfect mathematical objects. And long ago, we learned from looking at the planets that they do not follow perfect circles. And by studying other parts of nature, one by one, this Aristotelian and Platonic drive toward mathematical perfection at the surface of nature has been abandoned. It's not that nature is not mathematically perfect. It is, but at a more complex level than Greek geometry was able to reach. However, one of these Greek mathematical conceptions has managed to survive unscathed and unexamined and unchallenged. And it's the idea that time is this perfectly smooth, featureless, frictionless surface. And the reason that is held to so tenaciously is because you can't do science without that idea. Why? Because science depends on this very subtle notion called experiment. And built into the idea of the experiment is the idea that you must be able to repeat the experiment. In philosophy of science, this is called the restoration of initial conditions. You have to believe, in order to do science, that you can restore the initial conditions of the system that you're studying and then let it go through its changes and watch it again and collect data and then restore the initial conditions and do it again. If it is so that time is not a perfectly smooth surface but some kind of moving landscape, then the idea of experiment begins to break down, because there is no such thing as the restoration of initial conditions. You can never step into the same river twice, Heraclitus observed. If he'd been paying attention, he would have noticed that you can never step into the same river once. But that's another story. So science, at some point in the Renaissance, made a hellish marriage with capitalism. And science began to be not about how good its descriptions of nature were, but how good its technological output and how marketable its technological output was. Well, at that point, the game was basically betrayed. Now, looking at quantum physics and looking at order through fluctuation and looking at non-equilibrium thermodynamics and some of these more esoteric realms in cosmology, it's clear that we were very naive about the structure of time. Notice that modern science is built around what is called probability theory. And the notion of probability theory is that if you want to understand how something works, you measure something about it 100 times, add those numbers together and divide by 100, and you now have the average behavior of the system. Now, notice how naive this concept average is. Again, it assumes that all moments are the same. No one would do physics, would take a physicist seriously who suggested that a given equation should be applied on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but that a different transform be used on all the other days of the week. That isn't allowed in physics. So we get to the point then with modern science where you could almost say that modern science is the art of describing those systems so crude in their structure that they are not subject to temporal variables. So this turns out to be stuff like the motion of the planets. That's pretty good. You can predict over fairly long periods of time. But in any long periodic system, chaos eventually makes Newtonian mechanics break down. You cannot predict the exact position of Mercury 100,000 years in the future. At that many iterations of its orbit, chaotic factors begin to enter and smear the values. This is important for this kind of thing. Okay, so what I'm proposing is to essentially admit the primacy of experience, the idea that time is a series of fluctuating variables. We experience it this way, we feel it this way, and then to look to, for example, the I Ching, Taoism, these more feeling-toned models of time, but to look at them with a formal eye. In other words, with a mathematician's intent. And what I've done with the I Ching is discovered a series of patterns in the King Wen sequence, and I'm assuming here most people have some knowledge of the I Ching and its purpose, which is, its stated purpose is to chart temporal variables. It is the book of changes. What we're talking about here is changes as opposed to the unchanging Newtonian duration. Anyway, embedded in the King Wen sequence of the I Ching are a series of mathematical transforms, now not so necessary to defend until we sort out this whole business with Watkins. However, since that was never part of these lectures, those of you who are not given to dedicating yourself to the altar of understanding the time wave are asked to judge it in a very direct an intuitive way, which is we look at history, which is a fairly known quantity, and we see if the predictions the theory has made about the past are sufficiently impressive that we should give a hoot about what it says about the future. See, it's easy to predict the future because who can naysay you? Predicting the past is considerably more chancy because it has undergone the formality of occurring. In other words, you're sort of nailed one way or the other. But if you had an algorithm that correctly predicted the ebb and flow of empire and the spread of technologies and the migration of genes and the spread of new religions and so forth in the past, you would have reason to trust its extrapolation into the future. The people who wrote the I Ching was pretty much finished before the earliest phase of what we call Chinese civilization. The Han Dynasty is from 400 BC to 400 AD. Before the Han is the Zhou. Before that is basically legend and myth. The I Ching seems to have come into existence in the early pre-Zhou period, meaning around 1300 BC. And the straight story, as told in the I Ching, is that there was this guy, King Wen, who got into some political trouble. He was an emperor, and he got kicked out in a coup and imprisoned. And in the course of his imprisonment, in his meditations, he discovered the I Ching and wrote it down. There's also an earlier figure, Fu Si, and who is often depicted with a tree growing out of his head. So what kind of person he was is not clear. A strong criticism of this theory, or I used to feel it as strong, was people would say, well, now let me understand this. Are you, you're proposing a revolution in physics based on a Chinese oracle, is that right? You're suggesting that we should chuck Newton and Einstein based on a 3,000-year-old fortune-telling book, is that right? Not exactly. The I Ching, my interest in it was not the text, which all that comes later. That's Han and later. Even the Confucian commentaries are early Han. I approached the I Ching as a mathematical structure, and I wasn't the first person to do this. A German guy, Martin Scharnberger, I believe his name was, wrote a book called Genetics and the I Ching, in which he pointed out that the I Ching is an exact homologue for the DNA. In other words, the DNA has 64 codons to code for all proteins. There are 8 amino acids. There are 8 trigrams. There are 64 hexagrams, so forth and so on. If you wanted a natural structure in language to model the DNA, you could not do better than the I Ching. So that's suggestive or interesting anyway, since supposedly these people we have no reason to believe these people understood anything about DNA. Nobody understood anything about DNA until 1950. But here's how I imagine things might work. Our own culture has an obsession with matter, and you see how far down the road to this obsession with matter has taken us, to the point where we can take the temperature of the interior of Betelgeuse We can create the anti-neutrino. We can build anti-helium in instruments at CERN. We can do amazing tricks with matter because we've spent a couple of thousand years obsessively pursuing this. Well, imagine a culture with a completely different obsession, an obsession to understand time, and an obsession to create a formal physics of experience. Pursue that a couple of thousand years, and you would be incomprehensible to any other culture, and you would probably know a hell of a lot about your stated area of expertise. So, I think that through something which let's just call meditation, and leave it there, and maybe with drugs involved, it's possible to look into the organism and not to see the molecular structure of DNA. But I've noticed that in the macrophysical world, like for example, heliotrope bushes, the leaves, the placement of the leaves of the heliotrope are a direct download of the placement of the genes for the leaves on the helix of DNA. So the macrophysical world contains in some portions of itself reflections of its deeper physical structure. So imagine a form of meditation, perhaps psychedelically assisted, in which you still gross body functions, breathing and so forth and so on, and your attention drifts down into the near-death domain. Well then, there you see the coming and going of phenomena of some sort. And perhaps this is a tradition, this technique, and perhaps it's centuries in its acquisition and the slow build-up of a picture of what this phenomena is. Categories of some sort, not an infinite number of categories, but some kind of syntactical deep structure. And then over time and through observational cross-checking, it's understood 64 such categories with unique qualities. And these become like the elements of our chemical understanding of matter. But they're the elements that build up time. Okay, then just one last metaphor about the I Ching. And this is how I really understand, or I think this explains it to me. This was satisfying to me. This is in an effort to answer the question, why should the universal categories be embedded in the human body? And here's the metaphor. Think of sand dunes. Picture them. Picture dunes. This is the most experiential moment of this weekend. Make the most of it. Picture dunes. Now, notice that dunes look like wind. We don't have to get into a semantic argument about this. It's true. Dunes look like wind. Now let's analyze what this means. Wind is a time-variable phenomenon that follows a gradient. Dunes are like a lower dimensional slice of this same gradient. Here's a metaphor which will help. Instead of thinking of the dune as made of sand, think of the dune as a computer. Think of every grain of sand as a bit. Now think of wind as a piece of software. The wind blows. The software is run. the bits rearrange themselves in the computer, and what we then have is a download of the instructions embedded in the software, now in the hardware. So if time is variable, replace the grains of sand, replace the bits of the computer with genes, and imagine that genes are being moved on a temporal landscape by the unfolding gradient of time as it expresses its categories. Then it becomes self-evident why the I Ching works and what it is, and why we have a resonance with the larger universe, and what all these nested and fractal worlds within worlds are. It's that there is a kind of master pattern. And you can say that at the bottom level it's in the DNA, and at the top level it's in time, and then it's reflected and its octaves are adumbrated in all the levels of organization in between. You can model it from top up or bottom down, but the pattern that connects is the primary datum of experience. Okay, so that's why the I Ching is a good way to do this. The mathematical details of how you get this wave out of the I Ching don't really need to concern us here. It's in the manuals, it's published, it's at the website. If you're of a bent to understand this, that's all there for you.
2007.
Yeah, in order to get the counterintuitive thing, as if the whole thing weren't counterintuitive enough, but the worst news is that it makes this prediction that is very hard to understand. It predicts that novelty, whatever that is, will reach infinity in 17 years. And I think this would be a much easier sell if that were 100,000 years out or 50,000 years out. The fact that it's 17 years out puts the whole thing into this, repent, for the end is near kind of messianic, inflated, megalomaniacal, bad taste, bad news kind of thing that I'm trying to avoid. I mean, I'm not really trying to found a cult. I'm trying to disentangle a fairly psychically charged idea that a lot of people would like to ride into cultishness, but that I find more interesting as a hypothesis than a dogmatic belief.